Hey guys, tonight we're settling in for one of those long, meandering history stories. So, if you've got your blanket, a cup of tea that's probably already gone cold, and the determination to stay awake, well, good luck with that. This is the kind of history where your eyes start to feel heavy right about the moment I start talking about dowries and guild restrictions. Which, honestly, is kind of the point. So let's sink in. Tonight's topic is the secret jobs of women in medieval times. And no, I don't mean being a queen, sitting on a throne, occasionally marrying your cousin for political stability. We already know about that. What I'm talking about are the jobs and roles that slip through the cracks of the official story. The things women actually did to survive or thrive or just keep a roof over their head while some duke in a castle was busy inventing new ways to get gout. And as always, we're going to move slowly, like wading through medieval molasses. Because, well, if you came here for high-energy medieval feminism, you clicked on the wrong channel. Here, we like our history calm. So, first things first. When we think about medieval women, the default image is usually a peasant woman carrying a bucket of water, or maybe a noble woman with a pointy hat that looks like an ice cream cone. That's because, for centuries, historians who were mostly men, let's be real, wrote about men. Kings, knights, bishops. The women were wallpaper, background characters. But if you peel back the layers a little, you start to see all these odd jobs, secret jobs, things women weren't exactly supposed to be doing but did anyway. Like, let's start with something that sounds wholesome but wasn't always. Healers and midwives. Midwives in the medieval world were the ultimate, we know you, but we don't really want to admit it profession. They were everywhere, essential, absolutely necessary, but also constantly suspicious in the eyes of churchmen. Because, a woman helping another woman give birth was clearly one step away from witchcraft, at least in the eyes of some cranky monk who hadn't seen daylight in years. But here's the thing. Medieval childbirth was dangerous, really dangerous. If you were a woman of childbearing age, there was a good chance this was how your story ended. And midwives? They weren't just there to catch the baby. They knew herbs, charms, the right prayers, and, let's be honest, sometimes just sheer emotional support. It was the kind of job that gave women a weird blend of power and precarity. On the one hand, if you were a respected midwife, your community depended on you. On the other, if anything went wrong, like the baby died or the mother died, you might suddenly find yourself accused of sorcery, which is kind of a bad Yelp review. Permanent, in this case. And of course, because the medieval church loved nothing more than sticking its nose into people's private lives, midwives were sometimes forced to double as baptizers. If a baby was born and it looked like it wasn't going to make it, the midwife had to do a quick emergency baptism on the spot. Because apparently, the biggest tragedy wasn't the baby dying, it was the baby dying without paperwork. Let's float to another job. Spies. Yes, women as medieval spies. Not the James Bond kind, more like, oh, hello, I'm just a lady-in-waiting carrying a tray of figs, and also state secrets. Women in courts, especially noble women, were actually incredibly useful for intelligence work. Why? Because everyone underestimated them, which ironically made them the best at listening, gathering gossip, and quietly relaying information. There are whole records of queens and duchesses basically running shadow diplomacy behind the scenes, like Isabella of France, who was supposed to just be Edward II's queen. Instead, she was also kind of an informant for her French relatives, and later, the person who basically overthrew him. That's a pretty impressive side hustle. But even at smaller courts, women were sometimes hired or at least expected to keep their ears open and pass along what they heard. Think of it as medieval intelligence gathering, but with more embroidery in the background. Now here's one of my favorites. Alewives. Yes, women who brewed and sold beer. In early medieval Europe, brewing was basically a household job. And like most household jobs, that meant women did it. If you wanted beer, and you always wanted beer, because the water was sketchy, women were the ones brewing it. For many women, this turned into a small business. They brewed ale, sold it locally, and ran what we'd now call a home bar. And yes, some were wildly successful. Others, well, not so much. Because medieval people loved to accuse alewives of cheating customers, watering down beer, overcharging, or serving it in cups smaller than advertised. The original scammy bartenders. But here's the twist. Over time, as brewing got more profitable, men decided, oh, actually, this looks like a respectable profession now. Which is history's recurring theme. Women build the business, men swoop in and professionalize it. Women get pushed out. By the 15th century, the brewing trade was male-dominated. But those early centuries, beer was basically a women's job. So, yes, your medieval pint probably had lipstick on it. And since we're on the subject of jobs that were, let's say, morally flexible, we should talk about sex work. Yep, women in the medieval world could end up as prostitutes. And while this sounds like the usual tragic history trope, it's worth slowing down to notice how normalized this was. Cities actually regulated it. Some towns had official brothels, often run by the city itself. Because, apparently, regulating morality also meant profiting from it. Prostitutes weren't exactly respected, but they weren't invisible either. They appear in tax records, court cases, even church decrees. And here's the odd twist. In some places, prostitutes were forced to wear certain clothes so they could be identified, like striped hoods or bright fabrics. Basically, a medieval uniform of shame, which is ironic, because half the knights and priests yelling about it were probably also their best customers. Now, let's float to another strange corner of medieval employment. Wet nurses. Yes, this was a job. Wealthy women often didn't breastfeed their own children because apparently feeding your baby was considered too undignified or it interfered with their social schedules. So they hired poorer women to do it for them. Being a wet nurse could actually be a stable job, though not always glamorous. You had to move into your employer's house, feed their child, sometimes raise them for years. And you couldn't have your own baby at the same time, because your milk had to go exclusively to the employer's kid, which is a depressing trade-off, if we're being honest. But again, it gave women a position inside elite households. Some wet nurses even became trusted servants or lifelong confidants of noble children they had nursed. So, in a strange way, breast milk opened doors to social mobility, which is not a sentence I thought I'd say tonight. And finally, before we drift into part 2 later on, let's glance at something that's part job, part reputation. Wise women. These were women who knew herbs, charms, maybe astrology. Sometimes they healed, sometimes they cursed, depending on who you asked. In villages, they were the go-to for everything from stomach aches to love potions. The church was less thrilled, because nothing says threat to Christian order like an old lady with some dried rosemary and a reputation. Over the centuries, many of these women became targets in witchcraft accusations, but in their own communities, they were often deeply respected, even feared. It was the kind of job you didn't necessarily apply for. It just happened once people started showing up at your door asking if you could cure their cousin's rash. And that's where we'll pause for now. Tonight, we've dipped into the world of medieval midwives, spies, alewives, prostitutes, wet nurses, and wise women. Just the tip of the iceberg, really. In part 2, we'll drift deeper into stranger, rarer, and occasionally sadder roles that women held in a world that mostly pretended they didn't exist. So, take a breath, sink further into your pillow, and when you're ready, we'll move on. So, we've wandered through the world of midwives, alewives, wet nurses, and wise women, which honestly already sounds like the guest list of a very odd dinner party. But the medieval world had plenty more jobs for women. Some practical, some embarrassing, some just strange. And, as usual, the historians rarely wrote about them, unless they were complaining. Tonight, let's keep floating through the lives of women whose job descriptions would never make it into official chronicles, but whose daily work probably touched everyone's life more than the king sitting on his throne with a crown that didn't fit. Let's start with something wet. And no, not beer this time. We're talking about laundresses. Now, this was a job that was both necessary and deeply underappreciated. Medieval clothing was heavy, layered, and not exactly made from moisture-wicking polyester. Add to that the lack of plumbing, soap that was basically glorified lye, and the general medieval enthusiasm for sweating, and you've got laundry that could qualify as a public health hazard. Enter the laundresses. These women scrubbed, beat, rinsed, and dried clothes, often by rivers or communal washhouses. It was backbreaking, messy work, but someone had to do it. And if you were lucky enough to land a job as a laundress for a monastery, or better yet, a military camp, you had steady work. Of course, steady work sometimes came with side hustles, which is a polite way of saying laundresses were often stereotyped. So far, we've slogged through the mud with laundresses, haggled in the market with fishwives, whispered with scribes, and nodded politely at beguines who were quietly reinventing female independence centuries before anyone thought to thank them. But now, let's climb the creaky wooden staircase of medieval society, all the way up to castles and courts. Because while kings and dukes strutted around in armor that looked impressive but probably smelled terrible, women at court were doing their own kind of work. Some of it, official. Most of it, not. And while history loves to tell us about knights jousting and kings issuing decrees, the women were often busy running the machinery of everyday power behind the scenes. Let's start with one of the least glamorous but most important roles: estate managers. Yes, when a nobleman went off crusading or, more often, drinking himself into an early grave, guess who kept the castle actually functioning? His wife. Noble women often managed entire estates, collecting rents, supervising staff, overseeing crops, dealing with tenants. Basically, everything. While their husbands were away pretending to be important, these women were balancing the medieval equivalent of QuickBooks. There are records of women writing letters to their absent husbands with lines like, "We need more oxen, the roof is leaking, and also your brother is trying to steal our land again." Imagine being stuck with medieval estate drama while your husband is off chasing relics in Jerusalem. And yes, some women got very good at it. A few even expanded estates, negotiated with neighbors, and strengthened family fortunes. So while the men got statues carved of them in armor, the women were the ones quietly making sure the castle didn't collapse. From land management, let's drift into the world of financial control. You don't usually picture medieval women as bankers, and yet some were. Noble women in particular often managed the purse strings of households. They arranged dowries, handled debts, and sometimes even lent money. Queens, especially, wielded financial power. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example. She controlled vast lands, collected revenues, and had more disposable income than most kings. And while history loves to paint her as the fiery queen, the truth is, she was also basically a financial powerhouse. Even queens with less personality than Eleanor often had separate incomes, drawn from dower lands. This gave them independence and leverage, because nothing says "don't mess with me" like controlling the money your husband desperately needs to fund his next war. Now, let's tiptoe into something spicier: informal diplomacy. Women at court were often the ones smoothing things over or stirring the pot when men couldn't get along. They wrote letters, arranged marriages, and acted as intermediaries. Queens were particularly good at this, since they were often foreign-born and had ties to their natal families. For example, Margaret of Anjou, Queen of England during the Wars of the Roses, wasn't just sitting around doing embroidery. She was negotiating alliances, corresponding with nobles, and raising armies. Her job description basically read, "Professional Crisis Manager." And Isabella of France, the so-called she-wolf of France, managed to topple her husband Edward II with a mix of diplomacy, alliances, and a very convenient affair. Which goes to show that sometimes the Queen's secret job was full-time political operator. Of course, not all elite jobs were about politics. Some were, let's call them, social engineering. At court, noblewomen were often tasked with managing networks of influence. Who got favors? Who got access to the king? Who was invited to dinner? It was the kind of invisible labor that doesn't sound impressive, but was absolutely crucial. Think of them as medieval social media managers. Only instead of likes and retweets, they were dealing with petitions and bribes. And instead of posting memes, they were arranging dances, seating charts, and introductions at banquets, which, if you've ever planned a wedding, you know is enough to drive anyone to drink. Then there's the educational role. Many noble women were responsible for educating children, not just their own, but also fostered kids from other noble families. It was a whole system. Sending your child to be raised in another noble household wasn't weird, it was networking. So, women at court weren't just mothers. They were teachers, disciplinarians, and moral guides for the next generation of elites. Some wrote handbooks on behavior. Others oversaw tutors. and occasionally they made sure the kids didn't accidentally stab themselves with their tiny practice swords. And of course, through this education, women could influence politics indirectly. Raise a king, shape a kingdom. Though, to be fair, sometimes the results were less wise ruler and more overgrown man, child with gout. Speaking of indirect influence, let's glide into the world of letter writing. We touched on this with diplomacy, but it deserves its own sleepy spotlight. Medieval noblewomen wrote so many letters. They wrote to husbands, brothers, children, allies, enemies. These letters are some of the best evidence we have for what women were really doing. Some were practical, updates on estates, instructions to servants. Others were political, lobbying for positions or urging military support. And occasionally, they were just passive-aggressive, like, "Dear husband, perhaps you could remember that you have a wife and children while you're gallivanting in Gascony. Regards." Letter writing was a job in itself, a constant drip of communication that held together the fragile networks of medieval power. Without it, half the kingdoms in Europe would have collapsed under their own laziness. And now for something more delicate. Ladies in waiting. On paper, they were companions to queens and noblewomen. In reality, they were also spies, secretaries, go-betweens, and sometimes scapegoats. Their job was to be close, attentive, and discreet, which made them invaluable. A clever lady-in-waiting could gather gossip, pass information, or even influence her mistress's decisions. But it was a precarious job. Too much influence, and you became a target. Too little, and you were ignored. And because courts were basically soap operas in fancy clothing, ladies-in-waiting often found themselves dragged into scandals, whether love affairs, betrayals, or treason plots. Basically, if medieval Netflix existed, the ladies-in-waiting would have been the main characters. Finally, let's end this part with a job that wasn't supposed to exist, but did: queens, as unofficial rulers. Whenever a king was away, or incompetent queens sometimes stepped in as regents. They signed charters, held councils, made decisions. But even outside formal regency, many queens quietly ran the show. Take Blanche of Castile, who governed France for her son Louis IX, or Catherine de' Medici in the Renaissance, who was basically the power behind the throne for decades. These weren't exceptions. They were part of a long tradition of women stepping into leadership when men couldn't be bothered. And yet, history loves to paint them as exceptional, as though it wasn't obvious that someone had to keep the kingdom running while His Majesty was off chasing a deer. So, we've strolled through castles, peeked into court letters, and watched queens quietly juggle the entire machinery of government while their husbands were off jousting or sulking in tents. But power in the medieval world wasn't just about thrones and titles. A huge amount of influence ran through another institution, the church. And while the church liked to insist that women should be seen, not heard, preferably kneeling in prayer, the reality was more complicated. Because convents, nunneries, and religious women in general held roles that were a lot more powerful, and sometimes a lot weirder, than official history books admit. Let's begin with the abbess. Being an abbess was basically the closest a woman could get to being a medieval CEO. She ran the convent, controlled lands, collected rents, managed servants, and oversaw spiritual life. In many cases, abbesses were drawn from noble families, which gave them serious clout. Some abbesses even minted coins, commanded troops, and sat in on political negotiations. So, while technically their job was pray and supervise nuns, in practice it was manage a multinational estate while pretending you're only interested in psalms. Take Hildegard of Bingen. She wasn't just a nun. She was an abbess, writer, composer, visionary, and all-around medieval celebrity. Popes wrote to her for advice. Kings respected her. And she still somehow found the time to scold bishops. If LinkedIn had existed in the 12th century, Hildegard's profile would have been exhausting. From abbesses, let's float down the hierarchy to ordinary nuns. Now, on the surface, being a nun sounds dull. Get up, pray, chant, copy manuscripts, go to bed, repeat. But many nuns carved out niche roles for themselves. They ran schools for girls, they provided health care, they even brewed beer. Because of course they did, everyone brewed beer. And convents weren't always cut off from the world. Families sent their daughters there not just for spiritual reasons, but for education. which meant nuns became teachers. And teaching in the Middle Ages wasn't just about reading prayers. It could mean instructing young noblewomen in managing households, finances, and even diplomacy. So, quietly, nuns were producing the next generation of competent women, even as society claimed women shouldn't be competent. But beyond abbesses and nuns, there was another class of religious women worth noting: visionaries and mystics. These were women who claimed direct spiritual experiences, visio,